Part 2. It took man 3 million years to figure out that his destiny is to rule the world. He was a slow starter. That's the way Homo Magister, man, the ruler of the world, tells the story. It's the way he sees it. The first 3 million years of human life were nothing but a long, tedious build-up to him. They really could have been dispensed with. But damned Darwin and his followers put them there. So useless, so pointless. It's like buying a print of Gone with the Wind and finding out that it has a leader 3 million feet long. So it's there. So what? Cut it off. Throw it away. That's the way Homo Magister sees it. He's looked at those 3 million years, and there's not much more to be seen in them than in the leader to a motion picture. It's like a film made up of a loop, endlessly repeating, showing people being born, living for a while, and dying, over and over again, 200,000 times. 200,000 generations, and not a shred of meaning in any of them. Futile. Pathetic. They might as well not have bothered. Homo Magister understands the people who lived those futile, pathetic lives. They were what he calls hunter-gatherers. Definition by occupation. That's what they did with themselves. Hunted and gathered. Well, why not? They didn't have anything else to do. Such a waste. If they'd only had the sense to know that they didn't have to live that way, that they could grow their own food instead of hunting it and gathering it, then they could have made something of themselves, could have started civilization, could have become Homo Magister a lot sooner. Then their lives would have meant something. Then the real story of man could have gotten started sooner. Homo Magister really sees it that way. He looks at them and sees that their lives were shaped by nothing, by an absence of knowledge, by what they didn't know. They didn't know that they could grow their own food, so they were stuck with this dumb, dead-end occupation called hunting-gathering. They couldn't get out of it, because they just didn't know they could become agriculturalists and civilization builders, which, as everyone knows, is the only truly human way to live. So when Homo Magister looks at the history of these people, he naturally perceives it as a void, as non-history. How else can you characterize it except as what was going on before anything happened? It's just before history, prehistory. It's a period of time as empty as the lives that created it. It's empty because nobody was doing anything, except hunting and gathering, and of course, battering stones. It was the Stone Age. Definition by product. Homo Magister would naturally see it that way. But it's not the only way to see it. Be imaginative. Forget products. Forget occupations. Imagine it a different way. Imagine that our ancestors were enacting a story. You know what enacting a story is. We're enacting a story here. A story about man becoming the master of his environment. A story about man's conquest of the world. a story about the fulfillment of man's destiny as defined by Homo Magister. We've been enacting it for some 10,000 years. Imagine our ancestors enacting a different story from ours. Not a story about man mastering his environment. Not a story about man's conquest of the world. Not a story in which products and productivity figured at all. Stretch yourself. Imagine that the story our ancestors were enacting shaped their lives, the way the story we're enacting shapes our lives. Different stories, different lives. Imagine that their lives had a different shape from ours because they were enacting a different story from ours. Go further. Imagine that enacting their story made their lives meaningful to them, the way enacting our story makes our lives meaningful to us. Different stories, different meanings. Imagine that the meaning of their lives was different from the meaning of ours because they were enacting a different story from ours. Go further still. Imagine that enacting their story, generation after generation, gave their history its shape, the way that enacting our story, generation after generation, has given our history its shape. Different stories, different histories. Imagine that their history had a different shape from ours because they were enacting a different story from ours. It's hard, I know, to imagine such things. It would be like asking an 18th century slave ship captain to imagine that the wretches chained up in his hold were actually human beings like himself, like his wife, like his parents, like his children. He would have thought you were pulling his leg. It gets worse. Think biologically. Imagine a completely different kind of story from the one we're enacting. A story for the entire lifetime of a genus, the genus Homo. Think of an outline for such a story. Not 3 million years of nothingness, followed by an explosive flourishing so violent that it consumes the world in 10,000 years, followed by extinction. That's not a story for the lifetime of a genus. Imagine a different story entirely. A story for tens of millions of years, for hundreds of millions of years. A real story. A story to be enacted. A story whose enacting shapes the lives of those who enact it. A story whose enacting shapes the history of those who enact it. Now imagine that that's the story our ancestors were enacting. It had nothing to do with mastering the world. Nobody was trying to master the world. All of it was about something else. Stretch yourself. Imagine that during the first 3 million years of human life, people were enacting a story, and that it was man's destiny to enact that story. Not just for 3 million years, for 30 million years, for 300 million years, for the lifetime of our planet, perhaps. Billions of years. It was that good a story. It was a good story, good for the lifetime of a genus. But it was not a story about power, about conquest and mastery and ruling. Enacting it didn't make people powerful.